Picture this, a home where silence hangs heavy, wedding vows spoken without feeling, and a hidden letter that changes everything. If you appreciate stories that unfold like gentle rain, revealing their secrets slowly and meaningfully, please show your support by liking this video and hitting subscribe. Your engagement helps us create more thoughtful, soul-stirring narratives. I always pictured my wedding would be filled with the scent of fresh flowers. Instead, that morning brought only the smell of aged wood and emptiness. Our ceremony unfolded in a polished chamber lined with dark timber, the atmosphere thick with generations of varnish and silent disapproval. No music played, no joy echoed, just the muffled sound of costly footwear against stone, and my heart's rhythm dampened by the restrictive silk of my gown. Lucas. Arden spoke little. He stood beside me, tall, composed, methodical, wearing a charcoal suit that perfectly matched his steel-colored eyes. No offered hand, not even a glance in my direction. When the officiant inquired if he would take me as his bride, he gave a single nod and stated, "I do," as arranged. Not from love, not until death, simply as arranged. The urge to flee overwhelmed me. Not from terror or sorrow, but because I suddenly realized the young woman I'd been, the one who dreamed of wildflower bouquets, intimate promises under weeping willows, and meaningful kisses, had already vanished. I'd buried her somewhere between the cancer ward, where my mother fought for life and the debt collector's voice that turned icy upon learning I was 24. Single and disposable dot, we signed the documents beneath a dim crystal chandelier. His signature flowed with certainty while mine wavered. Following the paperwork, he didn't offer his arm or guide me from the room. He merely addressed the attorney. "We'll review the arrangement at year's end. Should she require modifications, she may contact our legal team." That served as our wedding celebration. The mansion stretched endlessly before me, too still, too ancient, too flawless. Gleaming railings shone like polished bone, while heavy drapes hung motionless. Each footstep I took resonated like a whispered secret. They'd arranged quarters for me, not ours, exclusively mine. A suite decorated with soft wallpaper and a mahogany armoire taller than any person I had encountered. I remained there extensively, studying my reflection, uncertain whether I resembled a bride or a business transaction. The gown, cream-colored and delicate, now felt like a disguise. I removed it gradually, the material caressing my skin like an incomprehensible whisper. That evening, I discovered the correspondence. It wasn't concealed, merely placed carelessly between aged volumes in the wardrobe's lower compartment. Books that appeared untouched for years. The envelope was light blue with worn edges, and the handwriting was unmistakable. For Emma, should I lack the bravery to speak these words, written in my mother's distinctive script, I positioned myself on the window bench, cold seeping through the glass into my spine, and opened it with trembling hands. "My dearest daughter, if you're reading this, I suppose I never found the courage to share everything. Your father made grave errors, not only against us, but others as well. One situation particularly haunts me, the Ardens. What transpired in that residence, Lucas's home, began long before your birth. I wish I could claim your marriage today is merely business. However, it's far more complex. It's the result of an unfinished story. I pray he won't make you suffer for your father's mistakes. And should he ever show you compassion, understand it's not weakness. It's a form of bravery." The letter concluded there. No signature, only an ink smudge, perhaps from her thumb or a fallen tear. I pressed the correspondence against my chest, feeling as though I held a fragment of her final breath, something she preserved in case I became lost in another's world. Outside, the estate's lights flickered distantly, creating elongated shadows across the trees. The greenhouse was visible from here, its glass panels gleaming like wet foliage. Within that silence, I recalled her voice again. During my childhood illnesses, she would sing softly in the kitchen, her voice gentle, occasionally off-key, but it represented home. I remembered how she'd dab perspiration from my forehead with her sleeve and whisper, "Rest now, my little star. The world forgives us when we forgive ourselves." I hadn't heard her sing in years. Sickness had stolen her breath. Yet tonight, her words returned like wind through a partially open door. The mattress was comfortable, but sleep eluded me. I kept thinking about Lucas, how he avoided eye contact, how he never touched me. Somehow that silence spoke louder than shouting would have. Was he angry, distant, or simply protecting himself? I couldn't tell, but I understood this much. I had wed a man who now shared my surname, but not my history. Not yet. Beneath the silence of these sandalwood walls, I sensed something pressing forward, like someone else's memory waiting to be acknowledged. That night, I whispered into the darkness, "Mom, was this the right choice?" The wind outside offered no response, but it carried the scent of sandalwood through my room again, curling like smoke beneath the door, as if the house itself had heard my question. Perhaps, in its own quiet manner, it would begin to answer. 3 days following the wedding, Lucas and I existed like strangers occupying opposite ends of a long, echoing corridor. We never shared meals or conversation. He departed before my awakening and returned long after I'd withdrawn to my room with an unfinished book and a restless mind. Some evenings, I'd pass his office and catch the gentle clink of ice against glass, his low voice during phone calls. But mostly there was only the sound of this house breathing, settling timber, distant timepieces, and wind rustling against aged windows. The quiet was a living presence, not an absence, and I wasn't accustomed to it. On the fourth evening, I awoke with a sharp throat pain and an ache behind my eyes. Fever had taken hold. I could feel it climbing, wrapping around my neck like climbing vines. The room spun softly while my skin alternated between hot and cold. I managed to stumble to the bathroom for a damp cloth, but by the time I returned to bed, everything blurred. I don't recall falling asleep, only awakening to the aroma of ginger. And honey, a steaming cup sat on the nightstand, still warm, its ceramic surface fogging the small plate beneath it. Beside it lay a folded note in precise, elegant handwriting. "Your mother used to prepare this. I hope it still provides comfort." I stared at the note longer than the tea. He had remembered, or inquired, or listened. The last time I'd been this ill, I was 13. I'd collapsed after gym class, and Mom had walked all the way from the bookstore carrying a thermos of hot ginger tea wrapped in a towel. She sat beside me on the sofa, humming softly, brushing my bangs aside. "Ginger clears the fog," she'd said, "in the body and in the heart." I sipped the tea slowly now, letting the warmth smooth the jagged parts of me. The flavor wasn't perfect, too much honey, insufficient lemon, but it was genuine. And in that moment, genuine was more than adequate. I remained in bed the following day, drifting between dreams and wakefulness. In one dream, I was a child again, hiding beneath the kitchen table, listening to my parents argue. My mother's voice was firm but weary. My father's was quiet, almost ashamed. I couldn't distinguish the words, only their weight. When I awoke, I found another cup of tea on the nightstand, still warm. No note this time, just presence. On the third day, I was strong enough to venture downstairs. I expected the house to be empty as usual, but stepping into the kitchen barefoot, wrapped in an old sweater, I found Lucas at the stove, sleeves rolled up, boiling water with the same intense focus he likely applied to board meetings. He looked up, startled by my appearance. "You're awake," he said simply. I nodded. "So are you?" He almost smiled, The first hint of one, anyway. It disappeared as quickly as it emerged. You shouldn't be out of bed. I was thirsty. He gestured toward the tea kettle. I'll prepare more. I hesitated at the room's threshold. You don't need to do that. He didn't meet my eyes when he replied. Neither did you when you agreed. There it was, a sentence. A crack in the silence. Not affection, not apology, but acknowledgement. He poured tea into a mug and slid it across the counter. I sat down slowly, feeling the cool stone beneath my palms. Thank you, I said. Lucas nodded and began cleaning up. I noticed the dishes were already done. The kitchen was too neat to have seen much activity. But this morning felt different, like someone had opened a window. We didn't speak afterward. But something had shifted. That afternoon, I went to check the mailbox near the front gate, one of those heavy brass ones covered in ivy. Only 2 envelopes waited, both hospital bills. Flipping one over, I saw it had already been paid. Not in my name, in his. Lucas had covered the entire balance for my mother's treatment 2 weeks before the wedding. My throat constricted. He hadn't mentioned it. No grand gesture, no conditions attached. Just a quiet decision that must have cost thousands. And something else, the willingness to help without needing recognition. That evening, I sat by the window again, sipping the last of the tea. I looked at my mother's letter, still folded neatly in the drawer beside me, still incomplete. If he ever shows you kindness, understand it's not weakness. It's a form of bravery. She had been correct. Lucas hadn't touched me or demanded intimacy, but he had stood in that kitchen preparing tea, and he had paid the bills that might have destroyed my mother, not as part of our arrangement, but as a choice. Outside, a late autumn wind stirred the trees. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and allowed myself to believe, for the first time since the wedding, that perhaps this house wasn't merely a cage constructed from debt and obligation. Perhaps it was a waiting room, and perhaps in time we'd learn how to meet each other within it. Rain had fallen overnight. The windows were streaked with thin rivers of gray light, and the trees bent silently outside the estate walls. I sat at the breakfast table, untouched toast growing cold beside a cup of tea I hadn't stirred. My fever had passed, but something else had taken its place, a tightness across my chest I couldn't quite identify. The letter. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. I had read it countless times by now. Every sentence carved itself deeper into me, especially the last line. Everything began in that house, this house. And it wasn't just about Lucas, it was about my father. After breakfast, I returned to the library. Not the grand one Lucas used for business meetings, but the small windowed room down the hall, the one that smelled of paper and winter and lemon oil. It reminded me of childhood. Rainy Saturdays spent with a blanket and a flashlight, my mother's hand resting on my back. As I read, I hadn't planned on discovering anything. I simply needed air that wasn't filtered through unanswerable questions. The shelves contained mostly business and legal texts, neatly organized alphabetically. But on the bottom row, wedged behind investor reports, I found a photo album. Dusty, plain, its leather spine cracked with age. Inside were black and white photographs. Some dated from the 1970s. A young woman in a wide-brimmed hat. A boy, Lucas, perhaps barefoot on the lawn. A man standing beside a car with one hand on the roof and the other holding a glass of Scotch. And then there he was, my father, smiling, confident, arms folded beside a younger Lucas, both standing before what appeared to be a small brick building. Some kind of shop, perhaps. No one had labeled the photograph. But I recognized my father's posture, that half smile he wore when he believed he'd already won. I stared at it extensively, longer than I should have. When I looked up, Lucas was standing in the doorway. He didn't speak initially, just followed. My gaze to the photo still resting on my lap. "You found it," he said quietly. I didn't know what to say. "That was the day he signed the lease," Lucas continued, stepping into the room. "My father gave him space in the storefront we owned. No collateral required, just a handshake and a promise." He paused, then added with a sharpness that didn't belong in the room. 3 months later, your father refinanced the property behind our backs and sold his shares. We lost everything. My father died of a heart attack 6 weeks later. The words dropped like stones between us. I stood up slowly, my voice caught somewhere in my throat. I didn't know. He never told us. Lucas looked at me, but not with blame. With something worse, understanding. I believed he was a good man once too. I opened my mouth to apologize, but the words felt hollow. I hadn't made the deal. I hadn't betrayed anyone. And yet here I was, wearing his name, living in the house built on the ashes of Lucas's trust. "So the marriage," I said, trying to breathe through the question, "was it just revenge?" He didn't flinch, just shook his head once. "It could have been. Maybe that's why I agreed initially. But I never wanted to humiliate you, Emma. If I did, I would have let the world know who you were, who your father was. But I didn't." He took a step closer, then stopped himself. "I thought maybe if I married you, I'd stop hating him. That somehow giving you a place here would ... I don't know, balance the scales." I nodded, even though nothing felt balanced at. All that after he left, I sat alone in the library with the photograph in my lap. My father had died a year ago, and I'd cried at his funeral, but not for the man. I cried for the loss of a story. I had wanted to believe in a father who'd been brave, honorable, someone I could model my own strength after. Now that story had a crack running through it. And through it, I saw a stranger. And yet, I also saw Lucas, still here, still carrying it, still trying. That evening, I sat beside my mother's bed at the hospital. Her color was better, her breathing stronger, but her eyes remained closed, and her hand in mine was still too light, like it had forgotten how to hold. I reached into my purse and retrieved the letter. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered. "You knew what he did, and you married him anyway. You stayed." I paused, blinking away tears. I think I understand now. Staying isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's resistance, a kind of grace. When I returned home, the lights in the kitchen were on. Lucas was at the counter again, sleeves rolled up, pouring 2 cups of tea. He looked up when I entered and hesitated. "I figured you might be cold," he said. I took the cup he offered me. It was hot and fragrant, ginger again, but better this time. "You adjusted the recipe," I said softly. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You look like you needed something real." I held the cup, warmth seeping into my palms. "So do you." We didn't speak again that night, but we drank our tea at the same table. And when I stood to leave, he didn't move. But he didn't look away either, and that somehow was enough. I had always believed that silence was empty, that when words vanished, people drifted further apart. But in this house, within these old sandalwood-scented walls, I was learning that silence could hold things. Things too fragile to name, things too sacred to speak. And sometimes silence was what remained after a choice that cost something real. It started with correspondence again. Only this time, it wasn't mine. It was left on the kitchen table, folded crisply in a cream envelope with Lucas's name in silver ink. I found it while searching for a spoon. I didn't intend to read it. I only picked it up to move it. But then I noticed the logo at the top, Wells and Langford, Corporate Acquisitions Division. Beneath it, a single line caught my attention. "We accept your voluntary withdrawal from the board." The offer to return remains open through fiscal Q3. Stared at it, heart racing. He had resigned from his own company, from the empire he had built with cold precision and almost brutal elegance, and he hadn't told me. I waited until evening to ask. He was in the sunroom, a quiet space with faded armchairs and windows overlooking the ivy wall. The light was soft there, like memories resting on your shoulders. He had a book in his lap but wasn't reading. I stood at the doorway, clutching the envelope in both hands. "Why?" I asked. Lucas looked up. His expression didn't change. "Because they wanted me to trade your mother's home for a seat I no longer wanted." I blinked. "What?" "There was a clause in the merger. If I sold off certain underperforming assets, I could retain my position. Your mother's property was one of them." I felt my legs weaken, but I didn't sit. "You resigned ... for her?" He nodded once. No drama, no declaration. "I told you I wasn't interested in revenge, and I don't need more money. What I needed was to stop pretending I built this alone, that I didn't owe anything." The room was quiet. Again, but this time the silence didn't sting. It settled over us like a worn quilt, familiar and heavy. I stepped closer. "You didn't have to do that." "Neither did you," he replied, repeating what he'd said weeks ago. "But we both did." There was a long pause. Then, without turning to me, he added, "I thought if I made enough, if I climbed high enough, I could undo what your father did to me. That it didn't fix anything. Not really. It just made me a man who kept score." I finally sat down, and now, he exhaled, "now I'm just a man. That night I made the tea the way my mother did. Ginger shaved fresh, honey stirred slowly, a touch of lemon just before pouring." He watched from across the room, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, not closed, just resting. "You memorized it?" he said. "No," I replied, setting the cup down in front of him. "I lived it." He took a sip, then another, and said nothing. But the way he looked at the cup, like it was something both familiar and impossible, said more than I could. "Thank you," he said, and the words were quiet but full. "It's just tea." He looked up at me. "Not tonight." We sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. No conversation, no plans, just the soft sound of night arriving, 1 second. At a time, I wanted to tell him that I saw it now, that his silence had never been empty, only careful. That maybe in some strange way, our marriage was no longer a cage, but a place where grief and kindness had finally met. But before I could speak, the doorbell rang. Lucas was the one who answered it. I followed a moment later and froze when I saw the woman standing in the foyer, tall, striking, in a wool coat that probably cost more than my car. She looked familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. She was older than Lucas, but only slightly. Her eyes moved from him to me, then settled with quiet calculation. "You must be Emma," she said, offering her hand. "I'm Margot, Lucas's sister." Sister, of course. I remembered now barely. My mother once mentioned a Margot Arden who ran a museum foundation on the West Coast. She had vanished from New York society years ago after a falling out with the family. No one knew why. Until now, Lucas's posture was straight but strained. "Why are you here?" Margot ignored him. "I came because someone told me Lucas Arden finally did something irrational." She turned to me, smiling. "Married the daughter of his enemy, sacrificed his company for a crumbling house, and learned how to brew tea all in the same month." I flushed. Lucas sighed. "Margot." But she waved a hand. "Relax. I'm not here to dig up ghosts. I'm here to say you're not him, Lucas. You never were." He looked at her, and something softened in his jaw. "That's not what Dad thought." "No," she said, "but Mom did, and so do I." She turned to leave, pausing only once more. "You chose to lose something for someone else? That's not failure, that's what we call grace." And then she was gone. Later, when we returned to the kitchen, Lucas sat at the table and rested his hand on the wood. Just one hand, still deliberate. You know, he said quietly, this house never felt like mine until you got sick in it. I blinked. That's a strange thing to say. He smiled slightly. Maybe, but watching someone you care about go through pain and choosing to stay anyway, that makes a place yours. That night, I returned to my room and found new correspondence. On the pillow. Not from my mother, from Lucas. It was brief. Thank you for staying. Emma, I see you now. I'm not keeping score anymore. My mother opened her eyes on a Thursday morning. There was no grand return, no gasp of air or whispered name. Just a blink, slow and deliberate. And then her hand tightened ever so slightly around mine. I had come to the hospital alone. A book. In my lap I hadn't touched in days. The sun was pouring through the window, catching the silver in her hair like frost on old linen. Her voice, when it came, was raspy and small. You cut your hair. I let out a laugh that broke somewhere in the middle. 3 months ago, she smiled, soft and crooked. Still looks better than mine. That afternoon, while the nurses adjusted her fore and brought in a tray of soup she wouldn't eat, I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath. Dot in my coat pocket, folded 3 times, was a letter. Not the old one, the half-written apology that had haunted me since the wedding. No, this one was different. New, written on a page torn from a notebook, still lined and slightly wrinkled. The ink was shaky, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My mother must have written it before her relapse, somehow knowing I would need it later when the silence between us was too heavy for words. Unfolded it now in the quiet stretch between fluorescent lights and the beep of distant monitors. Dearest. Emma, I've seen how you look at him and how he looks at you when he thinks you're not watching. He's not your father, and you're not me. You are braver than I ever was. You asked the questions I didn't have the strength to voice. I married for love, then stayed for pride. You married for duty. But if you choose to stay now, let it be for something softer, forgiveness maybe, or peace or tea. Love you always, Mom. I pressed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. There were so many things she had never said when I was growing up. Things about my father, about her own regrets, about how love sometimes looked nothing like the fairy tales. But this was more than enough. This was the kind of truth that doesn't need to be loud. That evening, I returned to the estate just after dusk. The sky was the color of pewter, and the trees stood black against it like ink on wet parchment. A fire crackled faintly somewhere within the walls. The house smelled of cedar and something faintly citrus. Lucas must have opened a window again. I found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, chopping ginger with that familiar deliberateness, like the world narrowed down to each slice. She woke. Up, I said quietly. He stopped mid-motion. Is she still herself? I smiled. Sarcastic, hungry, already asked me to sneak in coffee. He nodded, then reached for the kettle. Good. She also wrote me a letter, I added, unfolding it on the table between us. I think she likes you, though she wouldn't admit it directly. She hinted. Lucas scanned it silently, then tapped a finger on one line. Tea, he said. Tea, I echoed. We drank together by the window, in the same spot I had once sat shivering with fever. Unsure of who I was or what I'd done by marrying a man like him, now I didn't feel unsure. I felt ... still. He watched the steam curl upward from his cup, then looked over at me. You know, he said slowly, I thought I'd lost my mother's voice years ago. She died before we could speak again. I nodded. Sometimes silence lasts longer than grief. He glanced at me then, really looked, not past me, not through me. You broke it? What? The silence between us. It struck me then we hadn't raised our voices. We hadn't argued in sweeping declarations or kissed in some rain-soaked epiphany. We had simply stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. Next morning, we drove to my mother's house. Not the one we had grown up in, that was gone now. This was the smaller cottage in Sleepy Hollow she had moved to before her health failed. The one with the blue shutters and the creaky porch swing and the herb garden that hadn't been tended in years. We didn't speak much during the drive, but when Lucas turned off the ignition, he turned to me. "If you want to stay here with her, I'll understand." "I don't," I said gently. "But I want her to stay with us." He blinked. "At the estate." I nodded. "It's not just your house anymore, and it's not just mine. Maybe if we fill it with enough voices, it'll stop echoing so much." He smiled. It was small but real, and it reached his eyes this time. That night, we made space in the West Wing for my mother. Lucas had the old music room converted into a sitting area, ordered new blankets, cleared shelves without needing to be asked. It wasn't extravagant. It was careful, intentional, like someone slowly replacing revenge with rhythm. As I tucked my mother in later that week, she caught my hand and whispered, "He makes good tea now." I laughed. "Don't encourage him." "Too late," she murmured. "And Emma, you chose well. Not because he's safe, but because he listens." Back in my room, our room now, I found one final note slipped between the pages of the novel I'd abandoned. "Weeks ago." It was Lucas's handwriting, just a few words. "When you're ready, I'll be here. Not because of your father or mine or anything we owe, but because I want to be." I held the note for a long time before slipping it under my pillow. And as I lay there, the wind outside soft and steady, I whispered to the dark the same words I'd once asked in fear. "Mom, did I do the right thing?" This time, I didn't need an answer, because I already knew. They say homes have memories, that walls remember voices, that floors soften under familiar footsteps, that over time a place learns to make room for the people who refuse to leave. I used to think this house would never feel like mine. It was too tall, too quiet, too filled with things I hadn't chosen. But now I was beginning to think that maybe it was trying to learn me. It began with small things. Lucas started leaving cabinet doors open, as if to say, "You belong here. Go ahead. Reach for what you need." I stopped tiptoeing past his study. We started bumping into each other on purpose. Mornings were still quiet, but not cold. We moved through the kitchen like a team in slow motion. He boiled water. I toasted bread. He read the paper. I listened to the news on low volume. Neither of us needed to fill the silence because, for the first time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was warm, shared. One evening, I came home from the hospital to find Lucas standing in the library, the small one, the one I'd found the photo album in. He had a hammer in one hand and a frame in the other. He looked sheepish. I thought maybe this wall could use something besides legal degrees. I stepped closer. It was the photo of my father and him standing outside the old storefront decades ago. I stared at it, confused. "Why would you hang this?" Lucas took his time answering. "Because that's where it began for both of us. I've hated it for years, but hating it didn't erase it." He paused, glancing at me. "And maybe hanging it is." My way of saying I'm done trying to. I swallowed hard. "That's not forgiveness." "No," he agreed, "but it's a start." A few days later, I caught a cold again. Nothing serious, just fatigue and a sore throat. But Lucas noticed. He didn't say anything, just brought a blanket to my reading chair, adjusted the thermostat, and left a steaming cup of tea by my side. When I looked up from my book, I found him standing in the doorway. "You don't have to take care of me," I murmured, throat scratchy. "No," he replied, "but I want to." That was the difference now. Everything that used to feel obligatory, duty, debt, penance, was becoming voluntary. Not because we forgot the past, but because we had decided to live beyond it. One morning, while reorganizing the pantry, I found an old jar of dried lavender. My mother used to tuck sprigs of it between folded sheets. I smiled instinctively, lifting it to my nose. Lucas walked in, watching me. "What is that?" "Lavender," I said. "Mom used to say it made dreams less cruel." Later that night, when I returned from brushing my teeth, I found a small lavender sachet tucked into my pillowcase. I didn't ask how he did it. I just said think. We still hadn't spoken about love, not directly. But sometimes it was there in the way he looked at me across the dinner table, or in the way he waited for me to finish my tea before he started his. One night, I came downstairs late and found the living room dimly lit. Lucas had fallen asleep in the armchair, a book open on his chest. His features, normally so sharp, were soft in rest, like a man unguarded, unarmored. I didn't wake him. I just sat across from him, curled up on the couch, and listened to the clock tick into a new hour dot. It felt like the house was breathing. With us, slow, gentle, steady dot, eventually, of course, the world came knocking. Lucas began receiving calls again, offers to return to the company, join new boards, speak at conferences. He turned most of them down, but one he accepted, a nonprofit. Foundation focused on financial literacy for low-income families. I overheard him talking to the director. "I know what it's like," he said, "to be taken advantage of by someone you trusted." I didn't say anything when he hung up, but I made his tea extra strong that night, and he drank all of it without a word. Weeks passed. My mother grew stronger. She began taking walks in the garden, wrapped in shawls and sarcasm. She asked Lucas, with a deadpan expression, why there were no birds in his hedge maze. "Even pigeons avoid you," she said. Lucas, to his credit, just smiled. "They know I don't negotiate with squatters." My mother told me later in the kitchen, "You should marry him again, this time for the right reasons." I laughed. "We never divorced." "Then renew it, or at least kiss him in public. You're giving the staff ulcers." I didn't know how to explain to her that our love, if that's what it was, wasn't loud. It was made of smaller things. Tea, blankets, books returned to their shelves. Silence without dread dot. It was the type of love that doesn't arrive like thunder, but like morning light. Slow, soft, and always there if you wait long enough to notice. One night, after my mother had gone to bed and the house was quiet again, I joined Lucas in the kitchen. We didn't speak, we just stood at the stove, shoulder to shoulder, stirring our tea. He poured mine first, then paused. "Emma," he said. I turned. "I didn't build this house for anyone, but I think I could rebuild it for you." I didn't reply. I didn't. "Me too." Instead, I reached for his hand, laced our fingers together, and stood there with him in the quiet dot. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt something deep in the house shift. It wasn't haunted anymore, dot. It was home, dot. It took me 3 weeks to say the words out loud. I want to visit him. Even then, I wasn't sure who I was telling, myself or Lucas. We were sitting in the sunroom, warm light slanting across the worn floorboards. The sound of wind catching in the hedges outside. Lucas didn't ask who. He already knew. We drove in. Silence the next morning. Not out of awkwardness, just reverence, like the road was its own.